So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the normal monthly meeting of the Libertarian Alliance, which is on the third Tuesday of the month. And today we have Kia, who's going to give us a talk on medieval thought, medieval political thought.
Something like that, yeah. Thank you, Dave. I'm going to apologise first of all because I always change the titles because I can never really decide what I'm going to say in advance. It's always very difficult, even then. If I decided to say something in advance, I would change it at the very last minute. But so I originally decided that I was going to talk about something like law.
Law in anarchy, I think. Was it? Law and anarchy, was it? Law in medieval.
Yeah, that's
anarchy was in the title anyway.
Yeah, indeed. So, but then I decided medieval political thought, and then Jan Lester gets in touch with Dave and says, "Is there a more specifically libertarian element to this?"
Yeah.
I hope there is. That's the answer.
It's scholastic libertarianism.
Yes, indeed.
So
well, yeah.
Live up to it.
I shall have a go. So most people, when they think about scholasticism and libertarianism, tend to think about the second scholastics, Suarez, Vittoria, Molina, Domingo de Soto, and so on, which they're fantastic writers. But I thought what I'd do, because my main interests are high to late medieval thought at the moment, I would look at some thought from that period, which seems to me to foreshadow some of the developments in Counter-Reformation thought. One of the problems for the development of something like libertarianism for much of the Middle Ages was the enormous influence of Plato. Another equally probably dangerous influence was the concept of Christendom. Of course, if you think in terms of big states, in a sense, you can't think in terms of small states and individuals. And that's something that I think has probably been done to death, if Plato hasn't as well. But I thought I'd look at the sort of the reintroduction of Aristotle from the high medieval period onwards, because it seems to me that the changes in the ways of thinking that came about as a result of the reintroduction of Aristotle have some pretty obvious. I mean, you can hopefully create your own relevance when you hear things that that sound sort of libertarian. Of course, the main figure that you have to talk a bit about when you're talking about the reintroduction of Aristotle into the West is Aquinas. And Aquinas was absolutely drenched in Aristotle, and what he, in many ways, seemed to be doing was essentially baptizing and confirming Aristotle into the Catholic Church. And he seemed to be creating some kind of hybrid between St. Augustine and Aristotle. So, and unsurprisingly, he sometimes failed to appreciate St. Augustine on his own terms, him being the main medieval theologian that everyone would look back to, mainly because Augustine was very slippery and rhetorical, much too slippery and rhetorical for a scholastic. And when Aquinas used a word, it would mean one thing only so far as the Latin allows, whereas Augustine would revel in ambiguity. However, the reintroduction of Aristotle into the West required a reconciliation of him with Christian orthodoxy. And as Walter Ullmann put it, Aristotle was received into the church. Walter Ullmann, by the way, I don't recommend on very much at all, certainly not on law. In fact, there's an academic I know at Cambridge who picked up the massive edition of the Roman law from the university library. And the last person to take it out was Ullmann. Hadn't been taken out since, many decades ago. And it had a little place mark in it, which was at something like page 5. And yet Ullmann managed to write hundreds and hundreds of pages about this stuff. And his poor acquaintance with it shows, because how you can explain all of medieval thought in such grand sweeping terms, like ascending and descending theses of government is pretty absurd. Now, since Augustine was one of the great creators and upholders of Christian orthodoxy, it may have been hoped that Aristotle would then serve as a basis to rephrase and refine Augustinian ideas. Now, when it came to this attempt at synthesis, Aquinas' attempt had some successes and some failures. But I want to sort of look at some Augustinian, stereotypically Augustinian, because the Augustine that is in Aquinas is quite difficult to find at times, and when you do find it, it's often a blatant misrepresentation of Augustine. And then I'll look at some Aristotle in Aquinas. So to start with the Aristotelian ideas, actually. For one, man is a political animal with a nature. Man is a social and political animal, and this is because man, unlike animals in some respects, must come together with other men to realise his needs and his goals, and because man has the ability to discover right from wrong. Crucial to the presentation by Aquinas of the idea of man as social and political animal living in a community in multitudine vivens, is the natural light of reason. Man has a nature, and above all, a nature which is not entirely corrupt or defective or impaired, and here Aquinas is following in the footsteps of William Auxerre, who maintained that, quote, Adam was not made bereft of all his gifts, unquote. For Aquinas, man has reason, unlike in the work of Augustine, and law exists in reason. In other words, law can be discovered and reasoned to, and it is objective and real in the sense that it was, as Aquinas writes in the Summa Theologicae, inserted into the minds of men by God. We can argue in order to discover the law. Law is not arbitrary, even when it is given by a sovereign prince. For what pleaseth the prince has the force of law, as Ulpian would have had it, is true then only if, as Aquinas says in the Summa, what pleases him is in accordance with some rule of reason. Thus, in the sense of the nature of man and the natural law, Aquinas is Aristotelian. He's also Aristotelian in the notion of a telos, or a purpose for man and for society. Because for him, men come together not only out of convenience, that they might live well, in the sense alluded to above, i.e. that man's nature is different from that of animals and his needs cannot be satisfied by living in isolation and without society, but that they might live well in another different sense. For men, Aquinas writes in De Regno, in Book 1, they associate to live the good life, to live according to virtue, and therefore, quote, the end of human association is a virtuous life, unquote. Furthermore, not only human society, but government in itself, as in Aristotelian political philosophy, should lead men to fulfill their end. Indeed, on politics, Aquinas is quite positive, and a far cry from the essentially anti-political and fatalism of Augustine. In his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, Aquinas writes of political virtue as, quote, in itself good, unquote, and says, quote, if it is informed by grace, it will be meritorious, unquote. The role of government, Aquinas tells us, in chapter 16 of Book 1, is to create the conditions in which men can flourish, and indeed to guide them to the realization of their purpose. Quote, to secure the good life for the community in such a way as to ensure that it is led to the ultimate end of blessedness. And I will come back to this, which I'm sure you'll have noticed, this dual end. The ultimate end of men is blessedness, but there is, if you like, an intermediate end which can be achieved solely, naturally, solely in political society. And this is to be achieved by, quote, commanding those things which conduce to the blessedness of heaven and forbidding those which are contrary to it. As Aquinas takes after Aristotle on purpose or telos, he does too on the question of the related notion of the common good. The law must be aimed at the common good, and for the law should not be directed towards the blessedness of an individual, as the argument goes in the Summa, quote, since every part of something is ordered in relation to the whole as imperfect to perfect, unquote, and therefore man being part of the community, part of a perfect whole, the law must seek to secure the common happiness. Two further Aristotelian concepts jump out here. First, law, and second, the perfect community. The following definition of law is advanced. Quote, a certain ordinance of reason for the common good made and promulgated by him who has the care of the community, unquote. And likewise, when Aristotle talks of the perfect community, this is most emphatically not Augustine's heavenly city. Instead, Aquinas talks of perfect community in the Aristotelian sense of the state. All must be directed to the common good in this state, and there is no room for individual private ends. Law and the state are both presented as organic, originating from the bottom up. There is a sense in which Aquinas' politics may be understood as one of Alban's famous ascending theses of government, i.e. with power and authority flowing up from the bottom, from the people. Likewise, for Aquinas in De Regno, as for Aristotle, there is a lengthy description of the various kinds of government, such as polity, aristocracy, and monarchy, and democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny, with the key Aristotelian distinction between defective rule and effective rule maintained, that of the ruler or rulers either ruling in the interests of the community or ruling selfishly, corruptly, degenerately, ruling for themselves. There are then clearly a number of Aristotelian political ideas in Aquinas. Augustinian political ideas in the political writings of Aquinas also feature. For instance, there's something clearly Augustinian in the surviving Neoplatonic elements of Aquinas, although there's not all that much. Aquinas is clear that the soul rules the body, and by implication, the distinction made between soul and body is still there. Aquinas is also essentially Augustinian on the importance of peace in society, and he defines peace in De Regno as, quote, the good and well-being of a community united in fellowship. This peace was to be maintained through the creation and preservation of unity, and it is thus that the consideration of the different kinds of government in De Regno can actually be read in an Augustinian light, since there is a discussion of how well these orders will preserve peace through unity. The conclusion of this discussion is that rule by a king is the best form of government, for there is not only the most likelihood that he will fulfill this Aristotelian role of providing for the common good, but he will be unlikely to produce civil war. For societies with non-monarchical governments, quote, toil under dissensions and are tossed about without peace, unquote. Moreover, the risk of the king becoming a tyrant is worth taking, since polities and aristocracies are likely to degenerate into civil strife in any case. Now, there is some ambiguity in Aquinas when it comes to how far you can resist and in what cases you can resist a tyrant. On a certain reading, Aquinas is essentially Augustinian on passive obedience to tyrants. The reason for the recommendation of passive obedience is twofold. Firstly, since the civil strife produced by rebellion against a tyrant may be imprudent, because it might disturb the peace and produce civil war, or in any case a worse tyrant. But also there's another Augustinian notion which seems not to sit well with the earlier Aristotelian view of man's nature presented. Tyrannical rulers are also defended as a punishment for sin. The basis for this is mainly scriptural, with chapter and verse from Hosea and Job, both supporting the concept of an unjust ruler inflicted on a people as the wrath of God. Aquinas agrees this can be the case, though he tempers it with the suggestion that unjust rulers given to subjects in the wrath of God are resented and do not last long. Still, the notion of coercive power as a punishment for sin is still there, and it's at least implicitly applied to all rule and not just effective rule, since the objection that political authority is unnecessary and contrary to man's nature is rejected by Aquinas. There's also a pretty stereotypically Neoplatonic body-soul dualism in the Summa, when Aquinas explains that Christians must indeed submit to secular powers. Aquinas argues that secular power only pertains to the body and not the soul, which remains free. Since grace redeems souls and not bodies, we may serve the divine law in our minds, and while not doing so with our bodies. Again, on the question of whether man is bound to serve the secular powers even though he is baptized, this is the case for Aquinas, since man is redeemed only from the spiritual servitude of sin, and not from, quote, the corporeal servitude by which they are bound to serve temporal masters, unquote. These temporal masters must be motivated by the right things, and these motivations are not honour, power, riches, or glory, which are fleeting and which in any case are not achieved well by seeking them. But rather, again in an Augustinian fashion, the temporal master must be motivated by Christian caritas and by the heavenly reward that he will get by performing his duty. The synthesis then is there. There are elements there, and there is an attempt at synthesis which may be seen primarily in an attempt to set up a set of dual ends, which is rather problematic because, of course, there is in Aquinas there is the idea of an ultimate end and an intermediate end, that is, of political society, and of course that's when a lot of the whole Thomistic system, at least politically, breaks down. But I want to now move on to some later thinkers and show how around the 14th century you start to see rather interesting developments which make this kind of which make the Thomistic system much clearer, which develop the system and make it, which provide a sort of stepping stone on the way to the scholastic libertarianism with which we might be familiar from the Counter-Reformation period. To do this, I want to contrast a couple of thinkers. One is Giles of Rome, and one is John of Paris. Giles of Rome on ecclesiastical power, and John of Paris on royal and papal power, respectively, are excellent representatives of two common medieval approaches to politics or political thought. Giles of Rome may be seen to represent the so-called hierocratic approach, in which all authority of all kinds belongs to God and is held by men only intermediately through the successors of St. Peter, and though influenced by Thomas Aquinas, the Neoplatonic influence is also clear, possibly through Proclus. John of Paris, however, is very different indeed. He is clearly influenced much more by Aristotle and by St. Thomas. For John of Paris, just as nature and grace are of God, so kings and priests are of God, and the two have their own rules and their own legitimate spheres of interest. The two Giles and John, therefore differ enormously on questions of property and dominion. They differ on the goodness or otherwise of temporal things, of riches and goods. Giles of Rome is a particularly extreme hierocrat in his line on property. The argument contains a number of parts, and it's difficult to piece them together as a coherent whole because this particular text of Giles of Rome is not particularly systematic. A right to property, to worthy possession of things, was conceived of as a divine grace. Following Augustine, hence a term that you will come across in the historiography of so-called political Augustinianism, which is, I think, based really on a misrepresentation of Augustine because he wasn't a particularly political thinker. But Giles argues that justice is the virtue which, quote, distributes to each what is due to him, And yet, true justice is absent where founder and ruler of the Commonwealth is not Christ. We ought all to be under Christ. We are, in fact, sinners. We exist indeed, in a state of sin. As Augustine would say, we live in the cyclum. Quoting chapter and verse from Ephesians 2, we are by nature children of wrath. And then he quotes the heavily penitential Psalm 54, behold, I was conceived in iniquities. And Giles concludes simply, we are not under our Lord. However, here a departure is made from Augustine proper, in that Giles then goes on to argue that since we are sinners, we cannot possess property. All property is rightly owned by the church, for we are made regenerate through the church and brought under Christ through the church. And since without Christ, under whose lordship is true justice, quote, you can have nothing justly, the church is the source of all property rights. Since the church reconciles sinners to God, and not our carnal fathers, it is from the church that our possession derives, and hence, through the receipt of divine grace, we become not heirs of merely carnally begotten men, but, quote, the sons and heirs of God, even though the church does not oversee each case of a transfer of property. Indeed, the church is rather liberal on this interpretation, in fact, in that it allows the faithful their temporal lordship, their dominion, which is only, quote, a particular and inferior lordship, all the while the church reserves to itself the true universal lordship. So we have anything that we have on the suffrage of the church. This particular and inferior lordship is to be made possible through the sacraments of the church, specifically baptism and penance or confirmation, or rather confession, which are the remedies against original sin and actual sin. And through these two sacraments one may be made, quote, a worthy lord and a worthy prince and possessor of things, unquote. However, it may be seen that there being the two kinds of sin, one original and one actual, there is of course room for the church to claw back property from any man should he fall into sin, since all hinges on the concept of the worthy possessor. Therefore, if any man falls into sin, specifically the turning away from God that results from mortal sin, even after spiritual regeneration through baptism and penance, quote, it is right and just that he should be deprived of his property. Giles of Rome is also opposed to the notion of the goodness of property itself in any sense. For Giles, the hierarchy of ends rules out any real goodness in the natural, because the natural is subject to the supernatural. And for him, quote, it is the habit of divinity to lead the lower through to the higher by way of the intermediate, unquote. Temporal things, goods and riches, should not be sought as ends in themselves, but rather should be used if, quote, ordered towards spiritual ends, to attain the hope of blessedness. Ultimately, the Neoplatonist influence on Giles is important here. For the ultimate end concerns the soul, which is greater than the body, and the latter is subject to the former. The soul is within the remit of the church, but so are temporal things, since the possession of temporal things, with their use in intermediate ends, which may lead to the ultimate end, is ultimately a spiritual matter. Therefore, wrote Giles, the church must be involved in these matters, since they, quote, bear upon the infirmity or health of souls, unquote. That, I think, is a very good summary of the classic hierocratic approach to the ownership of property, which had been held by the vast majority of such thinkers who applied themselves to it throughout the medieval period. But through the reintroduction of Aristotle, you see something much more amenable to a libertarian view of property. For John of Paris thought very differently about this. For John, the influence of Aristotle and Aquinas is much more apparent, and there is much more emphasis on the natural. John sets out to rebut the argument that the church is the true owner of all temporal things, and spends a number of chapters doing it. For one, a distinction is made between lay property and ecclesiastical property. The Pope may have some lordship over ecclesiastical property, since this property is granted to the community as a whole, by which he means the church. Lay property, on the other hand, is not, and so we cannot argue by analogy from ecclesiastical to lay property. The property of laymen rather belongs within the human law, which is to follow the natural law, since man acquires property himself, and John of Paris is very clear about that. Property is acquired, quote, by individual people through their own skill, labour and diligence, and individuals, as individuals, have right and power over it and valid lordship, unquote. John uses Augustine to support him when he makes the point that, quote, it is the human laws which make property common or belong to individuals, unquote. Each man may therefore use his property as he sees fit, except in cases of necessity, where the common good is in peril, or in which case it is the prince and not the pope who is to intervene, and the pope may simply grant indulgences to the faithful if they help during this time of necessity, and, quote, no power beyond this has been given to the pope, unquote. Moreover, there seems for John no reason grounded in the Christian faith to abandon or supersede the natural law. The arguments as put forward, he rebuts one by one. For instance, the arguments that Christ himself had jurisdiction over the property of laymen, such as the fact that Christ in Matthew 21 whipped the traders out of the temple in a manner that suggests he held authority over lay property, or that in Matthew 8 he sent demons into pigs without asking who owned them. These arguments are, quote, easily dismissed, since he was acting as God in such cases. We, of course, are not God. For John, important to stress is that Christ's kingdom is not of this world, and does not therefore concern, quote, judicial power over temporalities. Rather, during Christ's teaching mission on earth, he gave examples of virtue. Therefore, John concludes, since Christ as man had no dominion over temporalities, it is the case that, quote, no priest at all may claim to be Christ's vicar in this. Thus, John dealt with the priesthood, church, and popes claimed temporal lordship qua vicar of Christ. But what of the Pope as vicar of St. Peter? In this case too, even if Christ as man had this power, he did not hand it on to St. Peter. Indeed, John is extraordinarily bold in downplaying the primacy of Peter among the apostles, when he points out not only that all apostles received the binding and loosing powers in Matthew 18, the apostles received this power and honour from Christ, and shared in equal fellowship with Peter. Since no one claims that the remaining bishops of the church, aside from the Bishop of Rome, insofar as they are successors of the other apostles, have the dominion claimed so frequently for the Pope. Furthermore, John invokes and quotes Bernard of Clairvaux to Pope Eugenius, when he writes, quote, this is the apostolic model. Lordship is forbidden, service is commanded. And so John concludes, quote, no one should claim that the Pope has such powers on a universal scale. For John of Paris to argue that the Church or the Pope, as head of the Church on earth, has such dominion, is to misunderstand what the Church is. The Church for John is a purely spiritual thing, and its priests have been given the power by Christ to dispense the sacraments to the faithful, and this is all. The Church's mission and purpose is a universal one and can be carried out by the immaterial spiritual sword. For Giles of Rome, things are radically different, and they were radically different for most thinkers before John of Paris and the first wave of scholastics. For Giles of Rome, quote, the Church can act against secular princes because the temporal sword is placed under the spiritual sword. Giles and John then disagree fundamentally on much more than lay property, because they have radically different ecclesiologies. Another question on which the two disagree is that of who comes first, kings or priests, both in terms of primacy or superiority and chronologically. For Giles of Rome, the answer is clear. Priests come first in primacy and also in chronology. They instituted kings. Not only is it clear that the church and the priesthood are higher in dignity on earth, but their power is greater and they came first, with scriptural examples given such as that of Saul and Melchizedek. Kingdoms which do not owe their existence to priests, such as Babylon, are not kingdoms but, quote, bands of robbers. Moreover, from a Neoplatonic argument that inferior bodies are under superior bodies, the analogy is made between secular power and spiritual power, and the conclusion made that if the secular power wrongs, quote, it will be judged by the spiritual power as its superior. For John of Paris, however, kings come first chronologically, simply as a matter of historical fact. And here it's important to think not just in terms of kings, but in terms of human society itself. Since there were human societies before Christ, but, quote, there is no comparison and there is no hierarchy as with Giles. Priests and kings both exist, but in parallel. Priests are spiritual, kings are natural. Therefore, for John, Giles's arguments about the superiority or precedence of priests over kings makes little sense, for the two operate in different realms. While John is willing to grant that the priestly role is perhaps more dignified than that of a king, this does not make priests superior to kings. Instead, the king is superior qua king, and the priest superior qua priest. The temporal power is more powerful, more dignified, etc., in temporal matters, while the spiritual power is greater in spiritual matters. A closely related question is that of the very purpose of human society and any governmental arrangements themselves, and it is also one on which Giles and John differ. For the question of superiority or primacy is connected with that of the purposes of the secular and spiritual powers. For Giles, again, there's the hierarchy of ends, with the ultimate end, the end of blessedness. For this reason, all must be subject to the Pope ultimately, since the task of secular princes is immaterial for the ruler of the Church. Therefore, the secular powers concerned with mere intermediate ends must naturally be, quote, subject to him to whom pertains the care of the ultimate end, unquote. For John of Paris, there is both the natural and the supernatural. There is nature and grace, the spiritual and the temporal. Dominion falls into the sphere of the natural and is to be judged in such terms. Therefore, in Aristotelian or Thomistic fashion, John, who, like Aquinas, defines man as a social and political animal, puts forward a clear sense of the ability of the secular powers to create the conditions for human flourishing. The purpose of government is most certainly not a spiritual one. Instead, the purpose of the secular powers is, quote, the common good of the citizens, not any good indeterminately, but that good which is to live according to virtue. Furthermore, this kind of moral virtue is not necessarily Christian virtue. For John is clear that this virtue may be regarded as, quote, complete without theological virtues. Thus, it is that the purpose of the secular powers differs from that of the Church. One is natural, one is supernatural. Any direction the Pope may give to the King is in matters of faith, but not in government. Pope and King have different purposes and must work in different ways, since governments are relative and particular, while the Church is universal. The precise workings of government therefore vary from place to place, since they concern the unchanging reality of the world, since they concern the changing reality of the world, while the Church concerns the unchanging and the eternal. The effect of this argument is to heavily circumscribe any lordship claimed by the Pope. Another point of divergence is on the question, where does authority come from? The two men naturally agree that all power comes from God. The divergence begins with from where the secular powers receive their authority. For Giles of Rome, all power is given by Christ to the successors of St. Peter, not just the power of the keys, but all earthly dominion. The Pope has plenitude of power, and this is true of each Pope, since each Pope is individually the successor of St. Peter, not of his immediate predecessor. For John of Paris, however, quote, the spiritual and temporal powers are distinct to the extent that one power is not reduced to dependence on the other, but just as the spiritual derives immediately from God, so does the temporal. Again, John does not think in terms of hierarchies or precedents, nor does he compare kings and priests, temporal and spiritual. Both temporal and spiritual derive their authority immediately from God. Thus, kings are kings not through the mediation of the Pope or the Church, but directly through the manner of their becoming kings, whether by election or through creation by the army or through feudal custom or whatever it might be. John applies his bottom-up approach to the papacy too, since the Pope is Pope because of the consent of the Church or those representing it. And therefore he argues that the Church, through a general council or the College of Cardinals, quote, might conversely unmake him. For John then, far from Giles of Rome's contention that the Pope has plenitude of power and is the Church, popes have no special temporal power. The approach then that was made by John of Paris is, I think very clearly foreshadows the approach that you can see later with the Counter-Reformation Jesuits and Dominicans from Iberia. What John of Paris is doing is he is developing the Thomistic system, and he is more clearly separating the duality, the two ends of Aquinas, the intermediate and the ultimate. He is more clearly separating the spiritual and the temporal. Now, to step back then from that and think about some significance that might have in the medieval period, you've got to bear in mind that since the 9th century, popes had been anointing and crowning Holy Roman emperors. I was talking a lot then about the Pope, but I might easily have spoken about the Western Emperor, because the way that the medievals thought, to the extent that you can talk about commonalities in medieval thought about Europe, was Christendom, and the way they thought about lordship ultimately was they would think ultimately about a dominus mundi, whether that was the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor or both. And while I do still refer to the medieval period, or at least much of it, as some kind of ordered anarchy in which there were interlocking spheres of interlocking jurisdictions, overlapping systems of law, to the effect that where there was, the hierarchies weren't terribly hierarchical, and tyranny was actually relatively, compared to nowadays, anarchy. And while monarchs were certainly not at the stage of being the sole rulers of territorially sovereign areas with great bureaucracies, what's interesting to see is that there's a kind of paradox in medieval political thought, whereas the earlier you go, the less it seems to represent the sort of anarchic nature of the medieval period. The earlier you go, the more you get theocratic political thought, the less you get any kind of political thought that would make sense of what was actually happening on the ground. And it takes the conflict between church and empire. It takes the breakdown of the unity of Christendom into nations. It takes the development of Roman and canon law, but also I would say the reintroduction of Aristotle to create some kind of political philosophy, which can then lead on to the systems of thought that we see with the second scholastics. But I'm conscious of the fact that I'm now trying to fill time, and I'll answer any questions at all.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you. Any questions? Aristotle, of course, is supposed to be a libertarian of some sort. Ayn Rand, of course, thought he was.
The dead
But,
sort.
but there's also the, he's dead, he's been dead for some time. Also, there is still living, I believe, Jonathan Barnes, who's the author of Aristotle in the book called Past Masters, who is an anarcho-liberal. So presumably Aristotle has some liberalism to him. Is there any questions?
Yeah. Sorry. Nice speech. Let me let's come to that quote from Augustine. What without justice is a state but a gang of thieves writ large? Now that sounds a very liberal, indeed a libertarian statement. It's just that if you look at what Augustine meant by justice, it may not have been terribly libertarian, because he allowed the state the right to control the opinions of its subjects.
Yeah, no one can really agree what Augustine
No.
thought. And it's because he contradicts himself. It's because he's not got a very clear writing style. He's where if Edmund Burke's 1757, I think, when did he write his essay on the sublime and the beautiful?
One of the early ones.
I imagine around
About then, yes.
about then. I mean, if that can be applied to thought, then Aquinas is beautiful. Aquinas is quite pretty and so on. But Augustine is sublime, but he's sublime because the reaction that he produces is it's not terribly intellectual. It's emotional, and I think it's very difficult to produce any kind of coherent political philosophy out of Augustine, despite the fact that there is this term, political Augustinianism, which no one can really define, despite the fact that it's used so often. I think what it really, I think what most people would take it to mean is sort of reform papacy stuff. Gregory the Seventh onwards. I mean, you can, to go back to this, to the temporal and the spiritual. There are sort of three ways of looking at the temporal and spiritual throughout the Middle Ages. One is church everything, and that's Gregory the Seventh, reform papacy, so-called political Augustinianism. Church controls everything. You must have Pope as Dominus Mundi. The other thing is the complete reverse, which comes in quite late. It's only articulated quite late with Occam, Marsilius of Padua, and so on, which is that the church must be completely subject to secular powers. In the middle, though, you've got quite a wide range of stuff, and Aquinas and Aquinas would probably fit quite well there. But now the band of robbers thing is very difficult to interpret, because it comes quite early in the text, I think.
Book 4.
Book 4, yeah. And Book 4 is not a terribly important book, as I remember it. All the important stuff happens in Book 19. And it's all really bound up with questions like, for instance, why should a just man be involved in government, or how should he be involved in government? And the only answer that you ever get from Augustine is Christian Caritas, because he doesn't have a separate naturalistic way of looking at government, or anything. Everything is spiritual. The only things that matter are the spiritual. The only virtues are theological. And so, I mean, hence why it doesn't really make much sense to talk of Augustine having a philosophy. He is just theology. And that the band of robbers remark is something that has been misquoted I see it misquoted by various libertarian blogs every now and then. And it just quoted on its own, it looks quite nice. It looks like Augustine the Libertarian, but nothing could be further from the truth, really.
How much of these chaps look abroad, as it were, to non-Christian parts of the world? Could they not see the importance simply of property acknowledged by others, and the liberty to work it, and the liberty to exchange produce? Did they ever come as? Could they not leave God out of it for long enough to explain why these people would seem to do quite well? They were obviously trading with the Middle East and the East.
Yeah, well, something I should have mentioned is another great virtue of the reintroduction of Aristotle onwards, that with, let's take both Aquinas and John of Paris, is they admit that heathens, Muslims, perhaps not apostates. Aquinas not apostates. John of Paris probably apostates. They can own property just like any other man, because you're starting to get a very clear separation of the temporal and spiritual, and because they're realizing that you're gradually, it is basically a halfway point between the early medieval stuff and people like Francisco Suarez. Francisco Suarez says the natural law is completely independent of God's will. And so it's really a stepping stone on the way to that. But Aquinas would be fine with Muslim rulers.
Plato famously said that the ethical was different, separate from theology, and if God exists, Plato thought he did, the question would arise whether God is good or bad. And most theologians know about this, because most theologians read Plato. And Plato poses this question. So there is a separate, most celebratedly pointed out in might does not make right and cannot make right. Might is one thing, right is another. And this is a celebrated thing all down from Plato onwards. This theology is quite separate from ethics.
Yeah, the damage to political thought is done not by Plato proper, I suppose, but by Neoplatonism, by essentially finding the insertion points and inserting Christian theology into Plato. Plato on his own is not terribly pleasant reading either. But I'm always told I'm very unenlightened when I say that. But my own reaction, if ever I read any Plato, I'm terrified.
Well, you don't like it?
Oh gosh, no.
Dialogue's quite jolly, I think. I mean, there's lots of fascist ideas in there and so on. There's Russell and Popper and people like that like that. But
would I be right in thinking that your basic view is that there's a distinction between a theocracy and a monarchy, a secular and non-secular?
Yeah.
The reason I would, because if that's the case, I would actually take a lot of issue with it, because if we look at, say, the situation with regard to Henry VIII, he requested 2 annulments of the Catholic Church, one after the other. The Pope admitted one, but refused the second. Now, one way of looking back on it is the breach between the UK and Rome was basically a question of inheritance and legacy, and who was going to actually have a male heir to the throne. But in actual fact, the second interpretation is perfectly valid, and to me, actually quite realistic, which is that King Henry VIII's family was very poor. He went up to Wolsey's Hampton Court, and when he saw that and how rich it was, he realised, as did Cromwell, how rich the church had become. They own nearly 80% of London. Now, the view going back on history is that Cromwell wanted Henry VIII to do the annulment because it gave them the pretext to nationalise all the church property. So basically it's not about secular and non-secular, it's about money. And it's always been about money. And Rome has always been in competition with monarchies for the control of Europe. And I just don't see the separation between the two, except in possibly a church and a service and a hymn and a prayer. Practical purposes, there's no difference. It's a pragmatic political decision on both parts. There's no separation. You can see this in Saudi Arabia now. They're going through exactly what we went through in the 15th and 16th century. They've got the Wahhabis on the one side, the royal family on the other, and they're in conflict as to who is in control of that country. The Wahhabis feel that basically they're been betrayed because they were supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the country, and the royal family have interfered in that by various reforms. The royal family feel that basically because the church has supported jihadists, that it's taking a political role. Now, in about 300 years, Saudi Arabia will be a democracy, just as it took us the same amount of time. But you have a modern laboratory now, where we have a country in the 21st century sitting in a medieval situation where you have a theocracy on one side and a monarchy on the other, and they're both corrupt. And it's all about money. It's about who controls that oil wealth, who controls that gas field. And I just don't see this separation between secular and unsecular. It really doesn't register at all. I think we're in modern times, we've actually grown up in Europe, where the Middle East has yet to catch up, is that the church now has taken over a role which the state has pretty much distanced itself from, which is basically social welfare. You can see the church involving itself in various charities overseas. You can see it involving itself in night shelters. You can see it involving itself, like the Red Cross, in hospitals. And that's what I see the present now. And if we go back to the medieval period, we can take that abstraction view, but it's very artificial. I don't believe the nature of people have changed since the 15th century. If we go back to Marlowe, the time of Marlowe, 1596, Marlowe's sitting in Deptford under house arrest. There's loads of migrants coming over from Europe, Protestants. There's an anti-migrant feeling and sentiment inside the UK against all these migrants coming in. Now the Crown and the politicians and the courtiers, they all want those migrants in because they're bringing money with them and they're pushing up property rents. And ditto, look how common it is today, the same situation. Free movement of people means rents go up, wages go down. And back in the 15th, 16th century, they had the same problem. And the church, now when Thomas More, I remember seeing the first film by David Lean, Thomas More, and I thought, what an amazing man. And then I actually grew up. I actually realised how bad Thomas More was, because if you read his biography, he had a house down in Chelsea, which was more or less a farm, and he had a barn full of food. And when the peasants ran out of food, they came to that barn and they said, we want that food. And Thomas More refused. Now, Thomas More was a Catholic before he was a patriot and a sort of advisor to the monarchy. And the result of making the wrong choice was his head ended up on a spike. But he was trapped because he couldn't find a legal way of sitting on the fence between the secular and the non-secular. And that's the problem. If you don't take sides, people will push you onto one side or the other. So I don't believe in this abstraction between secular and non-secular at all. Church has always said to monarchy, we will support you and say you rule by divine right. The monarchy has always said, we rule by divine right because the church supports us. It's been a partnership and a wedding made in hell.
Yes or no?
Very good.
I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, consider it not possible you be mistaken.
No, there's some stuff I agree with, some stuff I don't. But I was principally talking about the abstract and principally talking about thought and not so much about who did what and when. Because what is interesting is, I think I said earlier, that when what's interesting in medieval political thought is the more is libertarian-ish ways of thinking come about when the political order is least libertarian. It's much like you see grand expressions of liberties and freedoms in charters and so on when they're most under threat. And so I don't doubt that some people have been insincere sometimes, but I wouldn't dismiss for instance, as much as I think this was a very illiberal and unlibertarian way of thinking, I wouldn't dismiss the hierarchic view of government as simply about power. You do have to make some room for sincerely held theological beliefs, especially back then, when that sort of stuff mattered much more, or people felt it mattered much more than they feel it does now. But yeah.
Bob? Queen Elizabeth, she did not peer through the windows into each soul, so it was almost keep it to yourself, don't rock the boat, and you're allowed to be a bit this and a bit that.
Tolerated Byrne, who was a Catholic, in the middle of the Westminster music.
Right, so he wrote such nice mass settings.
Oh, it's a little bit
anyone.
And much else besides. Oh, some could get away with it, yes. Give it to yourself.
Anyone else who wants to speak?
Yeah, actually, I wonder if you could just clarify something. And with St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, they were renowned, or this is what the argument used to go in. I remember in the 1970s when we were arguing with the feminists who were on the march then, that they were very pro-prostitution, those two saints, in their theology. Just to quote from St. Thomas Aquinas.
In theory or practice?
St. Thomas Aquinas, he actually said, if you do not allow this, what you get is something much worse. And that's a direct quote.
Well, Augustine used to use prostitution.
Now, we used to quote that to the feminists in the 1970s.
Did it go down well?
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say
The same kind of stuff has come up after the Reformation. John Calvin, predestination. So he used to, he would more or less come to the same conclusion, but by a different means. But when you have a look with the new wave feminism, for example, the Nordic model of feminism, that's in direct contrast to that. And I just wonder how you feel about those.
Do they wear
So
spiky
you're talking
helmets?
about libertarianism and these models today and the old models of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. I mean, how would you square those two?
With difficulty. I would say.
Onto a soon day.
Would you say they were more libertarian?
I've never been back. You've asked the question.
Well,
Now wait for the answer.
oh, yeah. No, here we are. Marco.
I've never been back. You've asked the question. Now wait for the answer.
Say yes.
Have you got the
I would say they're
quotation?
more libertarian, because basically
Augustine used to do this.
what we have today is a certain hypocrisy masquerading as political correctness.
Absolutely.
And basically, nobody wants to say anything now of exactly what their opinion or their statement.
Nobody.
Because they'll be identified.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they'll be identified.
He's taken it all on himself.
Without actually getting censored for it. And I think that the problem we've got today is that we're getting more and more censored, you know. And
I think so.
in a sense, he's right. Back in that time, we had more freedom of speech than we do today. I mean, it's like you tell me whether that's the case or not.
It's a very difficult comparison to make. Nowadays, anyone can just go on the internet and write whatever they like.
Well, that's not true.
No,
That's not true.
On a personal note, I'm very interested in mental health, and I always say, and my view is quite radical, I always say I would like them all sacked.
Right.
But like psychiatrists, social workers, you name it, are not replaced.
Right.
I think they're part of the problem. But people won't even take it seriously, me saying this. As soon as I start saying this with good reason, you can see they don't even want to contemplate that there may be some sense in it.
Yeah,
If
but
anything, it's closed. You know, some discourse is closed.
Exactly.
It won't even be considered.
Yes, but you're the worst
Hang on a
offender.
bit.
Well, you just
Speak up, Mr.
Hang on a bit. Hang on a bit.
I'm not laughing at the way.
Dominic!
Order.
Dominic, let's try to get into some sort of discussion here. Of course, you can get books on the myth of mental illness by Sachs, and they can go from there. But do you got anything more to say on this
No,
question of prostitution? Nothing more.
We've
I mean,
lost
Augustine used to use prostitutes, but that's true. Yes.
We paid them, I hope.
Of course, he paid them.
Well, they were using him as well.
So, is there any more questions?
I'm not laughing at what you're saying, Pat. I'm laughing at the way it comes
Any
up.
questions?
Every subject
Any
can
more
be
questions?
used as a forum. You have a certain talent.
I think we can thank the
for
speaker.
promotion, I will give you that.
Right, there's no more questions. So, all right then, I think we'll
Well,
thank
yes,
the
it
speaker.
is.